Prabhupada. O my Lord, you have executed all duties yourself. Are you leaving us today, though we are completely dependent on your mercy and have no one else to protect us, now when all kings are at enmity with us? Please repeat. O my Lord, you have executed all duties yourself. Are you leaving us today, though we are completely dependent on your mercy and have no one else to protect us, now when all kings are at enmity with us? Purport. The Pandavas are most fortunate because, with all good luck, they were entirely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. In the material world, to be dependent on the mercy of someone else is the utmost sign of misfortune. But in the case of our transcendental relation with the Lord, it is the most fortunate case when we can live completely dependent on Him. The material disease is due to thinking of becoming independent of everything. But the cruel material nature does not allow us to become independent. The false attempt to become independent of the stringent laws of nature is known as material advancement of experimental knowledge. The whole material world is moving on this false attempt of becoming independent of the laws of nature. Beginning from Ravana, who wanted to prepare a direct staircase to the planets of heaven, down to the present age, they are trying to overcome the laws of nature. They are trying now to approach distant planetary systems by electronic mechanical power. But the highest goal of human civilization is to work hard under the guidance of the Lord and become completely dependent on Him. I'll read that sentence once more. The highest goal of human civilization is to work hard under the guidance of the Lord and become completely dependent on Him. The highest achievement of perfect civilization is to work with valor, but at the same time depend completely on the Lord. The highest achievement of perfect civilization is to work with valor, but at the same time depend completely on the Lord. The Pandavas were the ideal executors of this standard of civilization. Undoubtedly, they were completely dependent on the goodwill of Lord Sri Krishna, but they were not idle parasites of the Lord. They were all highly qualified both by personal character and by physical activities. Still, they always looked for the mercy of the Lord because they knew that every living being is dependent by constitutional position. The perfection of life is, therefore, to become dependent on the will of the Lord, instead of becoming falsely independent in the material world. Those who try to become falsely independent of the Lord are called anatha, or without any guardian, whereas those who are completely dependent on the will of the Lord are called sanata, or those having someone to protect them. Therefore, we must try to be sanatha, so that we can always be protected by the unfavorable condition, so that we can always be protected from the unfavorable condition of material existence. By the deluding power of the external material nature, we forget that the material condition of life is the most undesirable perplexity. The Bhagavad Gita therefore directs us, 7:19, that after many, many births, one fortunate person becomes aware of the fact that Vasudeva is the all-in-all, and that the best way of leading one's life is to surrender unto Him completely. That is the sign of a Mahatma. All the members of the Pandava family were Mahatmas in household life. Maharaj Yudhisthira was the head of these Mahatmas, and Queen Kunti Devi was the mother. The lessons of the Bhagavad Gita and all the Puranas, specifically the Bhagavat Purana, are therefore inevitably connected with the history of the Pandava Mahatmas. For them, separation from the Lord was just like the separation of a fish from water. Srimati Kunti Devi therefore felt such separation like a thunderbolt, and the whole prayer of the queen is to try to persuade the Lord to stay with them. After the battle of Kurukshetra, although the inimical kings were killed, their sons and grandsons were still there to deal with the Pandavas. It is not only the Pandavas who are put into the condition of enmity, but all of us are always in such a condition. And the best way of living is to become completely dependent on the will of the Lord and thereby overcome all difficulties of material existence. Om Gyanatimirandasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chaksurin Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Mano Bishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raganatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Visakhan Vitam Cha Hey Krishna Karna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorange Radhe Vrindavaneshware Vishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasati Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So this beautiful verse once more, spoken by Queen Kunti directly to Lord Krishna. O my Lord, you have executed all duties yourself. Are you leaving us today, though we are completely dependent on your mercy, and have no one else to protect us, now when all the kings are at enmity with us? So this is Queen Kunti's heartfelt appeal to the Lord to remain personally with them, herself and the Pandavas in Hastinapur, rather than returning to Dwarka, as was the Lord's intent. And we can see her feeling of complete dependence on the Lord here, and completely under his shelter. And she wants to maintain that position under his shelter. And Prabhupada explains that our duty is to act with valor, to do our duty, and at the same time depend completely on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the material condition is very bewildering for us, and because of that bewilderment, because of ignorance, avidya, as she spoke in a previous verse, because of this ignorance, we tend to think ourselves independent. And in fact, that is complete illusion. We are dependent moment by moment on the mercy of the Lord. That at any moment mercy can be reduced or withdrawn, and then we can see we are simply pawns in the hands of material nature, which is so powerful. And yet, people struggle, mankind is struggling, inventors are struggling to try to harness material nature, and all they do is create increasing difficulties, increasing problems. And we're in the midst of that now in our very day and age. There's a very profound example of the automobile, which has been around over 100 years now. So the automobile appeared to be a great invention. We could get from point A to point B very quickly. And as a result of this wonderful invention, getting very quickly from point A to point B, now people live so far apart, you'll be hundreds of miles from your friend. Previously, everyone would be in a small village, a community. We could easily see our friends. Our business would be there. Our relatives would be there. The doctor would be there. Now, if you want to see the friends, you sometimes have to go into an airplane and travel so far. To see the doctor, you have to sit in traffic, go so far. To go to work, again, so much ordeal. Every time I go out in Sydney, everyone says, well, we can't go now, there's too much traffic, we have to go at such and such a time. So we're controlled by the traffic in our effort to be independent, we create this invention that creates so much trouble. Not only that, but you have to think of all the people that are suffering in the factories to make the cars. The parts are imported from all over the world. There's an international trade going on for these cars. So much land is covered with concrete, asphalt, so we can drive these cars, whereas that land could be used for fruit trees or flowers. And then, if all that isn't enough, we have accidents and people are maimed or killed by this attempt to improve things. And yet no one looks at it. And we have to think of the pollution that's created by these automobiles. We're breathing this air full of pollutants because we have to get from point A to point B quickly. We're not satisfied walking. We're not satisfied going by a horse or a bullock cart. So because of these intense desires, as Queen Kunti said in a previous verse, avidya kama, because of ignorance, we have so many material desires. We struggle to fulfill these material desires, and we miss the very point of life, which is to increase our affection and our love for Krishna and his devotees. So this is a tragedy, and the crisis that this mentality creates is now making our planet gradually unlivable. And yet people fail to see that. And yet the Pandavas are a wonderful example for us because they were so qualified, not only in terms of their character, but in terms of their abilities, what they could do, incredible warriors. And yet, the first thing Queen Kunti says here in the translation to Krishna, Krishna, you have executed all the duties yourself. She is taking no credit for her or her son's abilities. She sees all those abilities are coming from Krishna, and it is by his grace that they were such magnificent warriors. They were always felt themselves dependent on the mercy of the Lord. They never missed that point, that whatever ability I have is the grace and the kindness of Krishna. So I must use that in his service, which is unfortunately missed completely in this world. Prabhupada says here, to be dependent on the mercy of someone else is the utmost sign of misfortune. So he writes earlier in this very same canto that what saps the vitality of human energy, such a powerful phrase, what saps the vitality of human energy, and he mentions different things, overeating, over sense gratification, over-dependence on another's mercy, as he says here, and also an artificial standard of living. These he mentions specifically. So if we're involved in that over-dependence of another's mercy in the material world, that saps our vitality. And yet to be completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord in a transcendental relationship is the most fortunate position we can be in. So our mentality is meant to shift. We're meant to have a different outlook by taking up the process of bhakti. That we don't want to be dependent materially, we want to be spiritually dependent. And in this way, develop our relationship with Krishna, develop our love for him, rather than trying to become falsely independent of the laws of material nature. And Prabhupada gives the example here of Ravana, who has this, what appears to us to be a ludicrous attempt to make a staircase to the planets of heaven. But in fact, that ludicrous attempt is being attempted today. We have in the United States, the NASA, National Aeronautic Space Administration, attempting to go to these planets. They claim they went to the moon, and there's some, they say, rocks from the moon in the Smithsonian Institution, which I saw some years ago, covered in plexiglass. And the odd thing about that to me, just as a layperson, was that when you see the moon, it's so bright, it lights up the sky. Practically on the full moon, you don't need street lights, you can go. And yet those rocks underneath that plexiglass in the Smithsonian Institution were dark. They weren't black, but they were a very dark shade of gray. So that was a disconnect. How can dark rocks reflect so much light? that you can see very clearly on the time of a full moon. So there are some anomalies there, and we can question these things. We're allowed to question such claims. But as Ravana tried to get a staircase to the planets of heaven, so our modern people are trying to overcome the laws of nature unsuccessfully. Whether they meant to the moon or not, they did not stay. Well, they spent millions of dollars, and what was produced? Well, we have some rocks in the Smithsonian Institution. That's what we have as a result of their attempts. The highest achievement of perfect civilization is to work with valor, but at the same time depend completely on the Lord. And this sentence we can carry with us as a modus operandi for us. And it's certainly what Srila Prabhupada himself exemplified, that throughout his life he did his duties in the Grihastha ashram we were speaking yesterday, in the Vanaprastha ashram and the Sannyasa ashram. Although in those later ashrams he had no apparent material facilities, sometimes he was without money and without help, and yet constantly acting with valor. Valor means he had this instruction from his spiritual master, and his whole orientation was, how can I fulfill this instruction given to me by my spiritual master? And because of that cent% dependency on the mercy of the Lord, we know, created a miracle. Prabhupada himself said at one point, looking back on it, he said, one old man coming with just a few books to the West, how can anything result from that? Now I see that it is a miracle, that Krishna had a hand in what happened. And similarly, Prabhupada is encouraging us, each one of us, to act with valor and depend completely on the mercy of the Lord, as the Pandavas did. Each one of us are also meant to do. It's not simply theoretical or very eloquent sounding words, but it's meant to be applied practically on a daily basis, on a basis of our lifetime. That when we make decisions, whether big or small, we have to weigh those choices. What is favorable for my Krishna consciousness? What is unfavorable? It's mentioned as far as surrender goes. There's 6 items in surrender. So the first 2, to accept everything favorable for Krishna consciousness, and then to reject everything unfavorable for Krishna consciousness. So in our lives daily, we have so many small decisions that we can weigh in that with those perspectives. And then periodically we have big decisions. You know, who will I marry? Where will I live? What service or what work will I do? So certainly, especially in these big moments, we have to see what is favorable and what is unfavorable for my Krishna consciousness. This is a part of surrender. So also to depend completely on the mercy of the Lord is another item of surrender. To feel that the Lord is my maintainer. To have no interest separate from the interest of the Lord. It's the 5th item mentioned as an item of surrender. And then also to feel completely dependent, completely protected, completely under the service of the Lord, so that one is always feels oneself meek and humble. So these are how the Acharyas have mentioned the process of surrender, some of the qualities of surrender. The Pandavas always looked for the mercy of the Lord because they knew that every living being is dependent by constitutional position. So Prabhupada mentions this point in the introduction to Bhagavad Gita, that although we want to be masters, we don't want to be servants. By constitutional position, we are servants, and that will never change. And so therefore, we find the parents serve the children, the students serve the teacher, the business owner serves the customer, we all serve the government. In this way, we must serve. And if we say, no, I'm not going to serve any one of those things, we serve our bodies. We must serve our bodies in terms of eating, keeping it clean, sleeping. And sometimes people decide not to serve family members. They have a dog, and then you can see them very loyally, walking their dog and waiting while their dog does its business. So we're meant to serve. We cannot avoid service. And we must see with our intelligence, well, who should I serve by my constitutional position? Who is worthy of my service? And when we analyze it in that way, we will discover that Krishna and his devotees, they are worthy of my service. And what I'm meant to do is to try to please Krishna and his devotees by becoming Krishna conscious and trying to give that consciousness to others. These things are pleasing to the Lord. Those who try to become falsely independent of the Lord are called anatha. So natha means Lord, and anatha means without a Lord, without the Lord. So they are without any guardian, whereas those who are completely dependent on the will of the Lord are called sanatha, or those having someone to protect them. So there's a beautiful prayer by Prahlad Maharaj in the 7th canto, in which he describes very practically that sometimes the parents try to protect the child with all their heart and soul, and still something happens to the child passes away. Sometimes the doctor uses all his expertise and all the medicine that he can acquire to help the patient, and the patient still does not recover. Similarly, sometimes you can have a very apparently sound boat, and you go in the boat and something happens and the passengers drown. So, although we can try these material ways for protection, ultimately protection is in the hands of the Lord. And it's a question of our remembering that and removing the ignorance that thinks that ultimately these material things will protect me, because that is fallacious. That is not going to happen, ever. And conversely, sometimes it appears that there's no hope for the patient and the patient will recover. Sometimes the boat may appear very full of faults, and somehow it'll get to its destination. So there's another factor at work, and that factor is the Supreme Personality of Godhead and His will. Prabhupada writes, therefore we must try to be sanatha so that we can always be protected from the unfavorable condition of material existence. By the deluding power of the external nature, we forget that the material condition of life is the most undesirable perplexity. So this is why we need sadhana bhakti. Sadhana bhakti means that daily we engage in hearing about Krishna, hearing the philosophy, chanting his holy names, associating with the devotees, because this power is so forceful, and the intention behind it is to keep us in this material world. And we want to defy that individually and collectively, and therefore to take heart in these simple activities that Prabhupada has given us and find our pleasure there and our freshness there and our challenges there are what Prabhupada wants us to do, rather than looking to the external world for pleasure and freshness and challenges. Because that not only is an undesirable perplexity, but that being deluded in that way will lead to repeated birth and death. We will miss out on the opportunity of this human form of life, which is so important. Bhagavad Gita therefore directs us, 7:19, that after many, many births, one fortunate person becomes aware of the fact that Vasudeva is the all in all, and that the best way of leading one's life is to surrender unto him completely. So out of thousands and thousands of persons, one will attempt for perfection. Out of those who have achieved perfection, only one will actually know Krishna in truth. And so how rare it is that someone will come, extricate himself or herself from the material world and try for something higher. Devotees are so valuable and so rare, and we should relish each and every devotee and try to encourage each and every devotee. This is a part of our duty. The lessons of the Bhagavad Gita and all of the Puranas, specifically the Bhagavad Purana, are therefore inevitably connected with the history of the Pandava Mahatmas. For the Pandava Mahatmas, separation from the Lord was just like the separation of a fish from water. Hare Krishna. So if you've ever seen a fish separated from water, it simply flaps helplessly, struggling to get back in the water because it's death. So similarly for the devotee attached to the Lord, they cannot bear for a moment separation from the Lord. We saw that with the gopis when Krishna left for Mathura, how they were overcome with feelings, intense feelings of separation from him. And so therefore, Prabhupada tells us that the Lord is present in the Bhagavatam, he's present in his holy names, he's present in his prasadam. So we can experience his presence. We need to take advantage of these different ways to feel his presence, and that is up to us. That is our prerogative. So if we use our intelligence and see the opportunity before us, we will be very enthusiastic to hear the Bhagavatam, to associate with the devotees, to chant the holy names of the Lord. And in that way, we will act with valor and at the same time depend completely on the mercy of the Lord. Srimati Kunti Devi felt such separation from the Lord like a thunderbolt, and the whole prayer of the queen is to try to persuade the Lord to stay with them. And Prabhupada explains that even though so many warriors, heroic warriors, had been killed on the battlefield, it wasn't that their trauma was over, because those heroic warriors had sons and grandsons who would still feel very much at enmity with the Pandavas after all this bloodshed. And so enemies were still present. And it is not only the Pandavas who are put in the condition of enmity, but all of us are always in such a condition. We will always, this material world means people are full of lust, anger, greed, envy, delusion, madness, as we ourselves have those qualities, trying to overcome them. So it means there will always be this competition between people, even within the society of devotees. There will be enviousness between people, even within the society of devotees. So as the Pandavas turn to Krishna, as Queen Kunti turns to Krishna in helplessness, despite all her abilities, all the ability of her sons, still before the Lord we feel helpless and depend completely on him, and in that way overcome the difficulties of living in this material world. So those are a few thoughts. I hope there's some reflections and comments. I know very often the classes don't leave time for reflections and comments, but to me they're very important. So I hope there's some this morning. Please.
In the beginning, you were talking about one of the technological advancements essentially is the car. I remember hearing a lecture, I think it's an early lecture, she was talking about how person was seeing how because of the car and everything going to be quite fast. But in a family, the child never gets to see his father, because by the time the child gets up, the father's gone. The child gets to see the father's back home. And Prabhupada actually makes the joke and says that the child actually asks his mother who's my father. So Prabhupada mentions that just trying to get from one place to another. So hearing that actually reminded me of that.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
And then I just went on that trail for a second, and then you mentioned the point regarding how Krishna actually does everything, and that he actually empowers us to do it. And I remember, I think I was reading in Buddha's book, that they were driving and Prabhupada saw a father told his child put a letter into the mailbox. I was thinking that actually the child did something, but he didn't do it independently. He didn't
Very beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. Thank you. Very nice.
So you mentioned that invention of the car causes a lot of pollution and other problems. We can extrapolate from the airplane as well. However, I can't help but think that if it wasn't for an airplane, we wouldn't have this car all over the world. So I heard it said by one Prabhupada disciple that this was all meant to be the invention so that Krishna consciousness would spread. It's all part of the plan. And then it would all crumble and it would all go back to the village life. So I guess it's like if it's used in Krishna service, then it's not bad that it's polluting. I'm not sure because despite all the the pollution from airplanes and automobiles, if we use them in Krishna service, they become spiritual, spiritual fire, spiritual airplane.
Yes, it's true that the saving grace of all these inventions is that sometimes they can be used in Krishna's service. But if we use our imagination, that Krishna consciousness spreads all over the world and people become Krishna conscious, then they can go back to the simple agrarian life and leave aside the airplanes and the cars and all the machinery they've created and just live in a simple way and use their leg power or their oxen to get from place A to place B. That's Prabhupada also wanted these farm communities where people would live simply and not depend so much on these machines that are so polluting and difficult to create. So yeah, while the machines are here, it's not that because Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu walked for 2 years to South India that we should all walk to try to spread. No, the machines are there, so we use the cars and the airplanes. But we're encouraging people to live more simply, to do away with these things, to realize that from the fruits of the earth we can maintain our bodies in a healthy way, very often more healthy than living in the cities, and progress spiritually, which is the goal of life. The goal of life is not to make a bigger, faster airplane or car, but to progress spiritually. I think that would depend on the devotees we're dependent on. That if we're dependent on qualified devotees, that they will direct our dependence to Krishna rather than to themselves. Whereas devotees who are less mature may want your dependence to be focused on them and not direct that dependence to Krishna and to Prabhupada. So it's really a question of the individuals involved. But just as if we're dependent on Prabhupada, we offer our prayers to him and our homage to him, he directs that to Krishna. It's not that it stops there. Whereas someone else may have some impurity, perhaps, and then the dependence will not be directed as much to the Lord. So in that way, we need to be careful who we become dependent upon. Very much so, yeah. That we're never expected to surrender our intelligence. So if we're given guidance in some way and we're wondering, is that actually right? We should be familiar with Prabhupada's teachings, his books and his lectures and his conversations to see, well, maybe that isn't quite right. Maybe that instruction the time, the place, the circumstance. I should not follow that just now. So that's very important. Thank you.
Just building on what you said there about the evolution of aircrafts and all these vehicles and how they're meant to facilitate Krishna consciousness. Remember, this is more of a comment than a question. Remember, not even a blade of grass moves without Krishna's will. Satchitananda Vigraha. So scientific advancement can only reach a certain point. I mean, Srila Prabhupada delineates in some of his books that they're trying to penetrate the realms of space, but they're still in the material sky. They're not going to reach the Brahmajyoti or anything like that. So, I mean, the earth itself is in one of the most lowest lokas, in the Pitta lok. It's a place full of, ignorance and passion and all these modes that are trying to fight our will to bring out our Krishna consciousness. And we've got the Paramatma, we've got the Super Soul as well, which is also trying to find, it's like two birds on a tree, really. So it's more of a comment that I do believe that there are things going on in the world to assist humankind in bringing up their spiritual consciousness, of course. It's all in Krishna's will. And maybe one day, these scientists, they may say, they might hear something. I mean, they're saying they're hearing certain sounds in the universe, and we all know it's Om. That sound is omnipresent, it's everywhere. So I am a strong believer that there are certain things going on at Krishna's will, but more so to bring up humanity. There is a school of thought, the Gaia theorists, who believe in the new sphere. The new sphere is an evolution of humankind where it leads to a profound cataclysmic rise in spirituality. And it's like more of a revolution. Now, there's lots of these things around, but Srila Prabhupada was quite adamant that in this Kali Yuga, that we should always make sure that we chant Maha Mantra Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. In previous yugas, they used to do sacrifices, they used to do yagnas, they used to have the ability to chant thousands of years and have demigods appear before them and ask anything. But in this Kali Yuga, you can't really do that. We're battling work and family commitments, and we have to all make a living as well. So, I mean, it's more of a comment than a question, but definitely I do believe ultimately that there are things going on to assist in the facilitation and uptake of Krishna consciousness. We are able to see broadcasts from Mayapur, from Vrindavan, thanks to the internet. We are able to also get, like just earlier, I didn't have what we read today available on the board. I just looked it up very quickly and I was able to find it. So, all these things help, and it's all in Krishna's will. All Krishna needs to do, and he does it, there's no accord, he's omnipresent. He casts his glance on material nature. Things get perturbed, and things start forming towards that elevation of Krishna consciousness. If you remember Black Lotus Bhakti Tirtha Swami's book, he had a rather spiritual enlightenment at a young age. He attributed it to an alien out-of-body experience, but look at Bhakti Tirtha Swami, what he did, what he achieved in Africa and so forth. So, everything is occurring at the will of Krishna, definitely, no doubt about that. And it's whether you can see that and catalyze yourself to just take those little steps. In Kali Yuga, ultimately, you take one step towards God, and God will take 10 steps towards you. This is very important. So, I do believe that there are certain technologies and things that are advancing in our interest of Krishna consciousness. And it's really how we use it to make sure that the word is spread further. And, for example, we could teach the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhagavatam through SMS and instant messaging. Keep people engaged, because in an age of distraction and notification, how do you keep engaged? So, these are all things that are happening externally, and it's how you perceive them and how you take it on board, I believe. Yeah.
I hope you're right. I hope the spiritual life takes flight in this age.
Like there is some necessity to the future, but
Mhm.
Taking action for the future to, with the intention that it will be served.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a beautiful analogy that when we do recordings, sound recordings, we'll have different tracks. One track may be for the vocals, one track may be for the piano, one track may be for the drums. You can have so many different tracks. So the devotee has this track, I am completely dependent on Krishna, that is there all the time. But then at some point, now I have to plan for the future. So that track of complete dependence is going on consistently, as, say the drums are going on consistently. But at the same time, say the vocal comes in, that, okay, now I need to plan to apply to school, or now I need to apply for a job. So that's going on, the practical application. But then you understand, I get the job or I don't get the job, that depends on Krishna. That's his mercy, or, So both things are going on together. It's not that it's one or the other for the devotee. As the Pandavas, they were fighting valiantly in the battlefield, and they were using all their expertise to win the war, but they knew at every step there's another track, and that is complete dependence on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And the endeavor is also dependent on Krishna. We don't have the ability to do anything unless Krishna's mercy is there.
Falsely thinking himself independent, and the devotee who depends Krishna. Prabhupada used in the morning book, and he sees like some stray dogs, they're very dirty and they're running here and there, and there's like a big rich man with a nice dog, and he's all dressed up and he's very clean and happy. And Prabhupada's been trying to see that externally the stray dogs, they may seem to be free, but actually they're suffering. They have no one to take care of them, there's no one to wash them and give them food, and always looking where they have food. So it's just Maya that makes you look, okay, he's free, and actually he's suffering, there's no one to take care of. Whereas the dog of the rich man is getting food daily, is getting nice shelter, and everything's being taken care of because he's complete dependence now.
Very beautiful. Makes it very clear. Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention. Hare Krishna, all glories to Srila Prabhupada, and thank you very much for hosting me for the past week. I'm leaving Friday morning, so all glories to all the Vaishnavas in Sydney ISKCON. Hare Krishna.